one of the issues that I feel is both interesting, but I also think that you focus on your work on the coup and generally speaking on oil nationalization, is that the whole larger issue involved is control of oil and not necessarily share of revenues or other political matters. It seems that this is how you see this. Also, in the light of the emerging revisionist history of the period, that some are questioning whether this was a coup or not, or even others who go to the extreme of accusing Mossadegh of being almost totally obsessed with anti-Western or anti-British or anti-imperialism and not serving the best interest of Iran. You have a very documented and you articulate a particular history of this period. Do you want to share with us what you think are the significance of your own work or the whole issue around oil nationalization?
Yes, before I get to that, I need to put it in the context of sort of historiography of basically what we were talking earlier about history from below, social pop history, as opposed to political history at the very top. Here, it would seem like if one is dealing with oil negotiations, oil demands, it's diplomatic history. Coup, of course, is basically a political history. And it seems to be not really about, I would say, history from below. But the reason I got interested in it is because, in fact, I saw nationalization of oil as something as a sort of a pressure from the public. So it was people's participation in politics. It was basically demands of the public that brought Mossadegh to power. After all, the National Front only had about 6 deputies in the Majlis, but it had the power of the street, the power of demonstrations, the crowd. And what resonated in the public, I think, from basically 50 to 53 with the demand for nationalization was this wasn't really just about oil division of profits. It was really about sovereignty. And if you put it in the context of that period in world history, you have more and more countries that were former colonial countries becoming independent. India, Pakistan, you can go all along the countries. And Iran, although officially was not a colony of Britain, it was viewed in Iran as a semi-colony, i.e. the main resources of the country, oil, were under control of the British company. So for Iran and for Mossadegh, oil nationalization was not just a question of diplomatic struggle with the British oil company. It was a question of gaining independence from British colonial power. And that's why it resonated and why it was so important, I think, for not just the National Front, for the whole general public in the country, that this was a way of declaring independence from Britain. And this was the scene, actually, both in Britain and Iran as a sign of Iran basically breaking off from British imperial control. So when the Anglo-Iranian oil company flag came down and the Iranian flag went up in Khorramshahr and Abadan, this was seen as sort of a way of Iran's declaration of independence from the British. So I think that's what often people, when they deal with this issue, especially Western historians, don't get that significance. They see it purely as a struggle about money and division of profits. This is, I think, what made it so important for Iranian history, made Mossadegh so important for Iranian history. And therefore, the coup and Mossadegh's overthrow had also similar, you could say, devastating significance and long-term consequences for the country.
This is great. Thank you. Based on what you said, two questions at least comes to my mind. One is that the fact that that this was the issue of sovereignty, but the sort of political process in gaining or achieving political sovereignty was through parliament, right? It wasn't a usual, typical anti-colonial process. Mossadegh came to power because he was a member of parliament and because of the pressure through parliament. And also subsequently, the conflict between Shah and Mossadegh was, one can argue, that was a sort of constitutional or legal conflict. I particularly would like to see if you want to address this second issue, is that the conflict between Shah and Mossadegh was really about democracy, right? Was about constitutionalism. It's about power of the monarchy that, say, starting from Reza Shah, did not follow what was on the 1906 constitution. Or what is generally your thinking about this? I don't know whether I can call it a side conflict, but there was this conflict going on as well as the issue of nationalization of oil.
Yes, I mean, they were running parallel lines. I think the Shah originally wanted to basically appear as in support of oil nationalization because he knew this was such a very potent issue in the public. He couldn't go against oil nationalization. But he always distrusted Mossadegh because Mossadegh from 1941 had differences with the Shah about constitution. And here you have to, the complication is Iran was, you can say, benefited or was cursed with two constitutions. One was the written constitution from the Mashrutiyat 1906, which was modeled on the Belgian constitutional monarchy, where the monarch was basically head of state, titular head of state, but power was concentrated in the parliament. And this was the way the Iranian constitution was supposed to work. But then there was the historical constitution of Reza Shah, where Reza Shah basically had ruled as one-man dictator by packing the Majlis by his nominees, and therefore he could get the Majlis to do whatever he wanted. So consequently, it was basically a fig leaf covering up his personal dictatorship. Now, after 41, after the Reza Shah abdicated, what the new Shah tried to do is to retain as much of his father's power as he could. He lost control over parliament, although he did still get a block of Vakil Majlis who supported the Shah. So that you can call them as the Darbari or royalists in the Majlis. There was a block of that. But the majority of the Majlis, even the 13th Majlis, and then even more so in the 14th Majlis, were no longer placemen of the Shah. They were much more independent deputies. But what the Shah managed to retain after 41, his personal control over the military. And he was adamant that no politician should trespass on his territory, the military. He considered that his personal property. And even Khavam, actually, earlier, even before Mossadegh, tried to appoint his own man as Minister of War. At that time, it was called Minister of War. And he was defeated. The Shah defeated him that. So the army, the gendarmerie, the police basically remained under the control of the Shah, even though the Shah lost control of the political process in the Majlis. But for Mossadegh, this couldn't basically be accepted because it was a violation of the constitution, especially since the army could use its influence during elections to nominate its own candidates to the Majlis. So that became a political issue between the Shah and Mossadegh. And it came to a head basically on Siatir, where the Mossadegh insisted on appointing his own minister of war, which then he renamed Ministry of Defense. And the Shah opposed that, and that resulted in basically the crisis of Qavam and Siatir. And Mossadegh, of course, won that struggle because of mass support for him. Again, it wasn't because of Mossadegh had a majority in the Majlis. It was because he had the vast majority in the streets, and the people in the public supported him against the Shah, not only on the oil nationalization, but also on the constitutional issue.
How do you connect the two issues? I don't want to say the issue of sovereignty is an external issue, but how could one fight, say, Mossadegh in this case, the most important colonial imperial power, but at the same time fight the Darbar and Shah and the sort of this particular tradition of the Shah control of the army?
Well, I don't think he had a choice, because what he realized before Siatir was that the Shah was actually now cooperating with Qavam and others to undermine oil nationalization. So it was actually, you can say the crisis there was triggered off by the fact that it was clear behind the scenes that the American ambassador was working very closely with Qavam and the Darbar, basically to undermine Mossadegh, bring Qavam to power, who would then basically sell out the oil nationalization. So it wasn't left to Mossadegh to choose when to pick up the constitutional issue. It was basically triggered off by what was happening or the pressures from the United States at that time.
Great. One last question on this issue. At least my understanding is that Mohammad Reza Shah did not oppose Mossadegh oil nationalization, and in a sense, quietly perhaps supported it. This is the public understanding. Have you find any hard evidence or any evidence at all in your research that shows that Shah, in fact, opposed, maybe indirectly, maybe secretly, opposed Mossadegh on oil nationalization issue?
Well, he couldn't publicly oppose it because of public image, but I think what he would, and you could see it through what happened after 53, the Shah was more interested in not necessarily having control over the oil industry. He was more interested in revenues. So as long as he could get increasing income from oil, he was quite happy. So he would have been happier on the sort of Ras Marat deal, which you'd renegotiate the deal with the oil company, and instead of getting 17% of the profits, you got, let's say, 50% of the profits. And he thought in those terms rather than in terms of sovereignty. And that's where I would say the Shah wasn't really a nationalist in that point of view. He was thinking in terms of more of dollars and cents rather than a sovereignty of it. I know after 54, always the image was that the national NIOC controlled the oil industry. It was after all called the National Iranian Oil Company. But in fact, when you look at it, and here we can see the new documents and stuff, all the way till 1979, really, the oil industry was denationalized. It was privatized. It was under the control of the big oil companies. They made the decision how much to produce, what they called to lift, who to sell to. And Iran really was a bystander. Iran had some oil wells outside the concession territory, but the vast bulk of the oil industry remained under the oil companies until really the concession ended. And it ended quietly. There was no uproar or crisis in 79. It just coincided with the revolution. The concession agreement just terminated then. So the situation actually changed quietly at that time.
I will just go back to a point that Dr. Mirsepassi mentioned earlier, and that is the so-called revisionist line. And I'm not going to play the devil's advocate. I can't bring myself to do that, but I would suggest that you talk to an audience interested in historiography and explain to us how it is historiographically flawed to blame the coup on, or at least please share your view with us. Was it a fault on Mossadegh's part to dissolve the Majlis and give the Shah a reason to put him aside, to remove him from office? And in your view, you already mentioned Qawwam al-Saltaneh and his collaboration with the Darbar at the time. Is it true that Qawwam could be considered a more rational, a more sane actor during the upheavals and during the nationalization process? And my other question has to do with OPEC. And if oil was denationalized, then how do we as historians, how do you as a leading historian look at the phenomenon of this cartel, as OPEC, and Iran's role in setting prices, Bretton Woods, 1970s, and the oil crises that took place? These are my two questions. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, very good questions. I'll try to deal with them. One, about last question about OPEC. And here, actually, what you see the Shah doing is, because I think he lost legitimacy because of the coup, he then tried to up his image by grandstanding as the big guy in OPEC and being militant against the oil companies, the West, and basically appearing as if he was at the vanguard of oil prices. The trouble is that once you look at the documents now, this was mostly grandstanding. This was basically image. In reality, what the British ambassador said, the Shah was actually a hawk on oil for about 3 months. And this was the period when the American Secretary of Defense described the Shah as a nutcase, because the Shah was talking about higher oil prices. It was actually, I think, during Nixon's administration, Nixon's as treasurer. But anyway, later on, of course, this became useful for royalists to claim that the Shah was undermined by the West, especially the oil companies, because he was so aggressive in the oil thing. And this way, of course, the Shah seems more militant than Mossadegh on oil and becomes a victim of the same forces. The trouble with that is, of course, the Shah had no control over oil prices. Your oil prices are controlled by supply and demand. If there's a less demand, of course, then oil prices decline. If there's a world demand, oil prices go up. And then who controls supply and demand? It's the oil companies in Iran. In most of the Arab world, by the 70s, oil industry was nationalized. Gaddafi was the first one to do that. Then the other oil companies, oil countries such as Iraq, nationalized. Even the Saudis nationalized their oil industry. So the states could tell the companies how much to produce, how much to export. So if they wanted to increase the prices, they would lower production. If they wanted lower prices, they would increase production. So the control was really in the hands of most of the Arab states. Iran had no control over this because the Shah didn't control the production of oil in his own country. The oil companies did. So if the Shah ordered BP to increase oil production, BP could just ignore them. Similarly, if he wanted to lower production, BP, Shell, whatever, Standard Oil, did what they wanted to do, which was basically profits. Their interest was profits, not to satisfy the Shah's demands. So basically, the Shah had really no control over it. So what he could do is he could go to OPEC and grandstand there and tell OPEC, oh, you should post up the higher prices. But that was up to OPEC to do it by lowering production or increasing production. Iran was basically a standby. That's why I would call it grandstanding rather than actually manipulating or being able to influence prices. So the Shah actually then did a lot of jigsaw stuff, somersaults. He offered to sell secretly oil produced by NIOC outside the concession areas to United States at a very lower price to fill up the American reserves. This was at the time when he was actually grandstanding that OPEC should raise prices. He was actually willing to sell it at a very cheap rate to undermine, would have undermined, of course, OPEC. And the only reason that didn't go through was because Nixon administration warned the Shah that this couldn't be kept secret. It would sooner or later, through Congress, be revealed that the American reserves were being filled by Iranian oil, and it was much cheaper prices that they were paying for it. So this view that the Shah was actually a militant on oil in OPEC is, I think, a very clever move by the Shah for imagery. But in reality, he really, because he didn't have control over oil production, he was really not really in a position to manipulate that. Now, going back to the question of Ravam, now Ravam had this very much image of, very Machiavellian, very clever politician, mainly because of what had happened over the Azerbaijan crisis, which actually, when you look at it, it was more due to luck. And again, he used this image to show that he'd actually planned it. He knew everything, what was happening, and what happened was exactly what he planned. It was actually much more complicated and much more contingent on a lot of other issues. But what I think the difference between Mossadegh and Ravam isn't really in question of political shrewdness. Ravam basically was, like the Shah, willing to renegotiate the oil deal to get more revenues. He wasn't interested in Iranian sovereignty. He wasn't interested in nationalization of oil. And that's why secretly he really dealt with Henderson before Siatir. And he assured Henderson that he would basically come to an agreement that would be acceptable to the West. And it was clear that what would be acceptable to the West would be that oil would not be under Iranian control. It would be under either the British control or preferably a consortium of oil companies. So that's the main difference between Mossadegh and Ravam. And I think it goes, again, it's really to the core of the question, the nationalization being about sovereignty, national independence, not about dollars and cents. And going back to the question of, was Mossadegh really rash in closing the Majlis? Here, it's actually it's very difficult situation because Mossadegh basically had no recourse, no alternative but not to close the Majlis, but call for new elections. Because what's often forgotten is the closing the Majlis was actually tied to a new law for having elections for the next Majlis as soon as possible. So it wasn't like he was undermining the parliamentary system. He was basically replacing that Majlis with a new Majlis, which hopefully he thought he would be more democratic and more supportive of him. And this he had to do because basically there was enough of a quorum in that 17th Majlis that the Americans and the British had rallied that basically brought the Majlis to a standstill. It was every time there was an important bill presented to Majlis to discuss, people would walk out. They claimed they were going on a pilgrimage to Rome or Mashhad. The quorum would be broken, then the Majlis ceased to exist. So you couldn't, there were basically no laws, no legislation passed. As a result, he felt that the only way to solve that problem was to have a new Majlis, and hopefully that Majlis then would be more cooperative with the prime minister. And remember, one of the things that also in the legislation, all the reform bills that were passed in the or were decreed by the prime minister, they could not become law until the Majlis actually endorsed them. So the decrees that he set out, like land reform, electoral reform, none of those could be implemented until a Majlis actually endorsed them. So he didn't have dictatorial powers to actually make laws. Bills could not become laws until the Majlis passed them. And the 17th Majlis refused to basically discuss any of that. So the only way he could get the country to function was to resort to a new Majlis. Now, going back to, often you find nowadays, reformists in Iran especially, argued that the Mossadegh should have been more flexible about oil. And by flexibility, there wouldn't have been a coup and democracy would have been more assured. I think what they're doing is making history contemporary issues. For them, of course, the present issue was, of course, the nuclear issue. And they're arguing that the present government should be more flexible on the nuclear issue in order to settle that. And they're projecting the current issue back to the oil issue, which was a very different issue. And in the nuclear issue, there is a possibility of a compromise because the West has accepted the right of Iran to have nuclear enrichment. In the oil issue, the West, despite lip service of nationalization, was adamant that the oil industry should not be in the hands of Iran. So that became an issue, very different issue where Mossadegh really could not compromise. The only way he could basically meet the American and British demands was to denationalize oil and to do what the Shah did under consortium. So I think a lot of people nowadays are projecting contemporary issues back to 1953.